Here we go back at it. Rome wasn't built in a day, and it will take us more than a day to understand this basic, fundamental, foundational culture for our Western civilization. This is part two, the rise of the Roman Empire. We left Rome as a city-state that was evolving into maybe something more the size of Italy. By 264 BC, Rome was going to encounter some enemies across the Mediterranean Sea, and we'll follow Rome's path from essentially a regional power to a Mediterranean one, one that would have been absolutely necessary if Rome was going to develop as a foundational culture for with such an important imprint on Europe, in North Africa, in the Middle East. How did the problem of defending a city grow into the problem of defending an empire? We'll take a look at that. How did the government made to govern a city strain when it had to govern an empire? Cheap bread and circus. What do we mean by that? We'll look at that briefly in this presentation. How did the power of Roman traditions, coupled with the burden of empire, disguise the empire following the death of Julius Caesar? The Romans will look at how Rome transformed into an empire, but maintained the illusion that it was still the res publica, the republic of its early history. And how was the culture of the Roman Empire similar to the Hellenistic culture we studied, that cosmopolitan culture of Alexander the Great that brought together Egypt and the Middle East along with Greece? This is the rise of an empire. You see, left a Roman century, a group of 100 soldiers, and a centurion is a man who's in charge of managing the 100 soldiers in a century. The Romans were known phenomenally for their military organization, the ability not just to bring an army to the field, but to maintain it, to move it. Engineering was key to the Roman military. They would build roads and bridges so the army could move. And by the time of the height of the empire, an army could move as fast as its feet, not impeded by rivers or by water, because Rome would manage to master the infrastructure that an empire needs to unite people together. In 264, well, look at 264 BC, 264 years before the Common Era, Rome secured most of what is today central Italy. But it had an economic and political rival. If you go across the Mediterranean Sea, remember Mediterranean meaning the middle of the earth to the Romans, there was a city-state called Carthage, which was founded by the Phoenician people in the Middle East. And it evolved into a sprawling empire covering Spain, islands of Sicily and Corsica, and also Sardinia in the Mediterranean Sea. But there was a rivalry between Rome, which was growing out of Italy, with the growing empire of Carthage. Now, because Carthage was born from a sea power that from the Phoenicians, they had an established naval tradition where the Romans had not. So in order to beat a rival that was across the sea, the Romans had to indeed be able to engage navally. And this is when the Romans built their first naval force. So there was a rivalry, a series of three wars, what went from 264 to 146 BC, a series of three wars, as I'd said, interrupted by periods of peace. Rome nearly lost the Second Punic War, and there was a famous Carthaginian general named Hannibal who almost took the city of Rome himself. The Romans had great respect for Hannibal, but Hannibal was eventually destroyed, and in a third Punic War that would occur less than a century later, the Romans believed that Carthage had to be destroyed forever, and indeed they destroyed the city, sold them into slavery, and salted the earth around it so nothing would grow. Eventually, centuries later, Carthage, northern Tunisia, would be a central breadbasket for the Roman Empire later on. Around the same time, Hellenistic kings in Greece and the Middle East who had sided with Hannibal, or not with Hannibal, but with Carthage following the death of Hannibal, would make an alliance, would become under the boot of the Romans. So the Greek world of the Eastern Mediterranean Sea would become the Roman world. Though Rome and Greece had encounters earlier, that the Greeks had many colonies in southern Italy, and by that point, the Romans had admired the Greek culture and saw it superior in some ways. So they absorbed a lot of Greek ideas. Their religions were similar from a more ancient history, but the Romans admired the Greeks and established and reestablished some of their architectural funds, some of their philosophy. The Romans drew very heavily on what the Greeks had built a few centuries before them. You take a look, we're at about Around 100 BC, you could see we talked about the Mediterranean, middle of the world. This is where Carthage is right here. There's Carthage right there. You can see that Rome now has responsibilities that are beginning to circle the Mediterranean Sea. But as Rome grew, so did its problems. When the conquest took place, there was a lot of booty, which is the prize of war that would come to the victors. Generally speaking, it would rise to the highest levels of Rome itself. And those people who would achieve that wealth would buy the slaves that flooded in from conquered territories. And these people grew incredibly wealthy. Meanwhile, farmers who lived in the countryside were put out of their farms because the rich people would buy the farms out and not needing labor because of slave labor. Slave labor forced a lot of poor farmers to flock to Rome to look for work or to beg for work. And the city became very large and very restive. The growing poor became very restive and they were looking for some savior. So from around the year 100 BC to the last century of the Common Era, military leaders promised the glory of war and land that would come for the people, for the poor people, to the point where the poor masses of Romans became more enamored, more in love with generals than they did with their government themselves. A popular general, like we could look at Gaius Marius, or later on would be Sulla, and of course the most famous of those was Julius Gaius Caesar. Julius Gaius Caesar, according to legend, was born Caesarean section. That's where the name came from his mother. But an ambitious general from a noble family, he saw the power that you could get by getting the power of the poor. So military leaders like Caesar would be able to get the poor people of Rome to see more hope in them than in Roman institutions. The days of Cincinnatus, of the soldier who handed over his power to the Senate when war was over, those days were gone. Caesar conquered Gaul, which you saw on the map in the previous slide, right up here. Gaul, which is modern day France. Caesar would later brag, I came, I saw, I conquered. And by 60 BC, his very loyal legions followed him, and he did the ungodly thing of bringing his armies across the rivers into Italy itself, which of course was a threat to the power of the Roman Senate. Caesar was famously to say the die was cast. When you're rolling dice, you can't take your bet off the table once you throw the dice. When Caesar crossed the Rubicon River into Italy, he is threatening the Roman Senate, and he couldn't pull back at that point. He was an enemy of the state unless he could conquer it. Caesar would eventually be able to gain the power of the masses and again became dictator and did something that was very un-Roman. He made himself dictator for life, and the Senate did not have the power to stop him. Because of his fanatical support of the poor, Caesar was able to pretty much run Rome single-handedly. And one interesting device that Caesar found very helpful is the way to use a process called cheap bread and circus. The people were hungry and they needed entertainment. And again, in the age before television, Caesar was generally, they decided to give these people some reality theater. The idea of having gladiators slay people in front, or having animals kill each other animals, or people being eaten by animals. The violence would go from morning till evening, and the building of large amphitheaters and subsidizing food for the poor made Caesar incredibly valuable. He rewarded his army with the stuff of victory, with booty. Propaganda, of course, Caesar would not just write about his conquest, he would build to make sure it was remembered. So Caesar's idea of getting the people, entertained so they weren't thinking too much about anything about except for how good Caesar was. The ideas of Roman traditions and the ideas of the Republic seemed to be fading behind Caesar's aura. Now, there's a little picture there below by George Orwell. He said, football, beer, and above all, gambling filled the horizons of their mind. To keep them in control was not difficult. This was a modern idea what cheap bread and circus is. Provide them violence. Don't let them think too much. Just keep them entertained. And if you could do so, and you were responsible for that, you can own these people. You can make them into sort of intellectual slaves. So that's basically what Caesar did. Now, we know, though, that this could not last forever. There were plots in the Senate because there was a fear that Caesar, his personality was so dangerous that he needed to go. So Caesar did have friends in the Senate. One of them was a man named Brutus. who had come to Caesar on, according to legend, on the Ides of March, March 15th, on 44 BC, asking Caesar for a favor, stabbed Caesar along with other senators, thinking they'd saved the republic. But what they had done created a civil war. In 20 years of civil war, Caesar's adopted son, a man named Octavian, would proclaim himself the first citizen by the Senate because he could create peace, and he was referred to as Augustus, which meant revered or holy, a god. Octavian basically is able to restore peace and order to Rome, but he does so in a new period called the Roman Empire, where the Senate and the Republic is gone. The Romans felt so uncomfortable with a king, the idea of calling Augustus a king would have been unpalatable, so they just referred to him as the first citizen. And there was no clear line of succession in this kind of monarchy, and that's going to be a problem we'll see later on. But Augustus, who would be the emperor of Rome, which was then governing Judea, which is in modern day where Jesus would be born, that's part of Augustus's rule. If you know much about the Bible, there's a story about when Caesar demanded a census. It's when Joseph and Mary were out to report back to their place of their birth. The Caesar became a generic term for king at that point, named after Julius Caesar. And by the way, it's also where we get the word czar and Kaiser from Caesar. His legacy was that important. That would be Augustus, and the Roman Empire begins around 27 BC when Augustus destroys the last of his enemies, including a conniving queen in Egypt named Cleopatra. The empire was a monarchy disguised as a republic, and Augustus began the process of limiting continual expansion, which of course had strained Roman government. Rome's power blended with the order of a monarchy and military discipline established 200 years of relative peace, known as Pax Romana. At the height of the empire, from England to Mesopotamia, from the deserts of the Sahara to the Black Sea, you could travel there unmolested, that there was relative peace. So ideas, people, products, and pathogens traveled freely through the Roman Empire in a 200-year period of impressive peace. As I mentioned, though, there was no clear process of succession. We're going to have succession, I should say. That, for example, Nero, who was a few emperors removed from Augustus, when he was murdered in 69 CE, 4 emperors followed that year alone, each of them being assassinated and replaced by another one. So the issue of succession became a problem in the empire. Imperial culture. Rome became a magnet for ideas, trade, and people, including what would become Christianity. Stability and transportation could connect people. Roman roads that were safe, Roman seas that were free from pirates or relatively free, even connecting distantly and indirectly the Silk Road to Rome, to China, that some very wealthy Romans had come to know silk that came from China at that point. It was a pretty limited trade, but it did exist. Given that time, pretty impressive. China at that time was also having its golden age. European cities would not be any cleaner, any richer until relatively modern times. We see public baths and aqueducts. Romans were largely open to new ideas. They did not interfere with core civic values, meaning as long as you worshiped the emperor, which was considered patriotism, patriae, coming from the term father, as long as you saw the emperor as God, you were okay. But we'll see that Christianity doesn't fit very conveniently in the idea of worshiping the emperor. You see an imperial flag there, SPQR. The Roman imperial flag stands for Senate Populorum Quorum. Try that again. Senatus Populorum, the popular senate of the people, K Romanorum, from the people of Rome. So that would be tattooed on Rome. If you watch Gladiator, you see that tattoo is on the gladiator's shoulder when he was a senator. It was the idea that the Senate still ruled, and the wreath of the laurels of victory, which of course symbolizes Rome's victory. So here are our key questions. How did Rome end up having to defend an empire? How did the government strain under this? Cheap bread and circus. How did it work, and how did it elevate someone like Caesar, which eventually would transition Rome from a republic into an empire? How did Roman traditions, coupled with the burden of empire, disguise the empire following Julius Caesar? And how was Roman Empire like the Hellenistic period that drew many cultures together? Okay, so be ready to answer those questions.